my soul in mercy to reclaim, and from the depths of sin and shame, through grace you lifted me. From sinking sand you lifted me. With tender hand you lifted me. From hopeless night into the light, I praise your name. You lifted me. You called me long before I heard, before my deadened heart was stirred. But when I took you at your word, forgiven you lifted me. From sinking sand you lifted me. With tender hand you lifted me. From hopeless night into the light, I praise your name. You lifted me. Your brow was pierced with many thorns. Your hands and feet by nails were torn. My crucified and risen Lord, in love you lifted me. From sinking sand you lifted me. With tender hand you lifted me. From hopeless night into the light, I praise your name. You lifted me. Now on a higher plane I dwell, and in my soul I know this well. From my own self-destructive hell, you are always lifting me. From sinking sand you are lifting me. With tender hand you are lifting me. From hopeless night into the light, I praise your name. You are lifting me. That is a hymn from 1905. It was written by Charles Hutchison Gabriel, or Gabriel, I don't know. Lived from 1856 until 1932. He was an Iowa farm boy. They had a reed organ at the farmhouse. He taught himself music, like at the age of 7, on that organ. He was self-taught. He was never able to read music. But this guy wrote around 8,000 hymns, including He Lifted Me. When he wrote this, it's clear he had been spending some time in the scriptures, most notably Psalm 40, verses 1 through 5, says, I waited and waited and waited some more, patiently, knowing God would come through for me. Then at last, God bent down and listened to my cry. God stooped down to lift me out of danger from the desolate pit I was in. out of the muddy mess I had fallen into. Now God has lifted me into a firm, secure place and steadied me while I walk along God's ascending path. A new song for a new day rises up in me every time I think about how God breaks through for me. Ecstatic praise pours out of my mouth until everyone hears how God has set me free. Many will see God's miracles. They'll stand in awe of God and fall in love with God. Blessing after blessing comes to those who love and trust the Lord. They will not fall away, for they refuse to listen to the lies of the proud. O Lord our God, no one can compare with you. Such wonderful works and miracles are all found with you, and you think of us all the time with your countless expressions of love, far exceeding our expectations. Is your story in there somewhere? Mine definitely is. Waiting and waiting and waiting some more, because God's timetable is so much different from ours. God lifting me out from the desolate pit I was in. In my story, sometimes that's a pit somebody else threw me into or circumstances threw me into. Sometimes the desolate pit I threw me into, out of the muddy mess I had fallen into. Again, sometimes thrown into the muddy mess by somebody else or by circumstances, but sometimes just jumping in. That's my story. And notice what happens. God lifts us up, stabilizes us, and helps us get to moving again, so that we can learn to avoid desolate pits, muddy messes. My story is in there. Probably yours is too. Charles Hutchison Gabriel was probably also thinking about Matthew's Gospel, chapter 14. Jesus sent the disciples in a boat across the Sea of Galilee. He went up to pray. In the middle of the night, there was a storm. And Jesus could see, the Gospels tells us, that from the shore, from the bank of the Sea of Galilee, Jesus could see through the storm, through the waves, in the dark, several miles, middle of the Sea of Galilee. Jesus could see that the disciples weren't making it. And so he came to them walking on the water. They were afraid. They thought it was a ghost. And Jesus said, I am. It is me. Don't be afraid. Peter said, all right, if it's you, tell me to come out there and come towards you. And Jesus said, come on. And Peter got out of the boat and stood on the water in the middle of a storm and was walking toward Jesus. But then it kind of caught up with Peter. 11 other guys were safer than him because they were still in the comfort zone of the boat. And he was out in the middle of the storm. Sensory overload, terror, torpedoed his faith. And immediately he went down and he screamed, Jesus, save me. And Jesus grabbed him and lifted him up and then said in so many words, where'd your faith go? What happened to your faith? Again, my story is definitely in there. Maybe your story too. So I want to talk a little bit about this hymn. He wrote it as a lively revival testimony song to be sung in Billy Sunday crusades. We used to sing this like when I was a kid in church with the piano and the organ and the man in a suit directing us. And this hymn was kind of funny because in the chorus, it has this hiccup. It is syncopated. And when we were singing it, and I was a little boy, in the chorus, it felt like bumper cars. It felt like musically we were just crashing in to each other. You may have noticed what I did with the song. I slowed it down, but I also verticalized it, and I sung it as a prayer. And now I just want to say the words as a way of summarizing Psalm 41 through 5, Matthew 14, and this incredible uplifting hymn. So settle in, just breathe, be still, and receive these words. In loving kindness, Christ, you came, my soul in mercy to reclaim. And from the depths of sin and shame, through grace you lifted me. From sinking sand you lifted me, with tender hand you lifted me. From hopeless night into the light, I praise your name, you lifted me. You called me long before I heard, before my deadened heart was stirred. But when I took you at your word, forgiven you lifted me. Your brow was pierced with many thorns, your hands and feet by nails were torn. My crucified and risen Lord, in love you lifted me. From sinking sand you lifted me, with tender hand you lifted me. From hopeless night into the light, I praise your name, you lifted me. Now on a higher plane I dwell, and in my soul I know this well. From my own self-destructive hell, you are always lifting me. From sinking sand, you are lifting me. With tender hand, you are lifting me. From hopeless night into the light, I praise your name. You are lifting me. May it be so for you and for me. Grace and peace.